Everyone, thanks for taking the time to be in this study. In this series, we are talking about our hearts and the enemies of the heart, which have a tendency to destroy all of our relationships. The enemy of the heart we're talking about today is greed. Now, greed is when we have a supersized sense of ownership. And greed differs from several of the other enemies because of how easy it is for us to miss. I mean, anger is usually unmistakable, and guilt, you can normally tell when you're feeling guilty, and jealousy, that comes out pretty clear. But greed's another story because it's not quite as straightforward, and this is especially true in our context where greed and consumerism are like the de facto way of life for most people. There's that joke about the horse that looks down at the pond and says to the fish, "How's the water?" And the fish says, "What's water?" The idea is that because the fish lives its entire life in the water, it doesn't actually think about the reality that it's in water. Well, we live our entire lives in a culture that's based on consumption and accumulation. It is the water that we swim in. And because of that, sometimes it's hard for us to tell the difference between what is greed and what isn't. Just another example of how this can be seen. The last house I owned was built in 1896, and it was an old 2-bedroom, 2-bathroom farmhouse, and it had a total of 3 tiny closets. Now, if you were to buy a new house of the same size, it would have a bunch of closets. A closet for each bathroom, a closet for each bedroom, a coat closet by the front door, some sort of storage closet in the living room. There would be a ton of closets in the house. In fact, most of us, we don't even want to think about buying a house unless it has a ridiculous amount of storage space. Well, why the change in houses over the last 100 years? Well, in that time, we have become much more consumer oriented. We buy a lot more stuff than they did 100 years ago. And all that stuff needs a place to go, so we have closets for clothes, closets for toys, attics for decorations. In fact, we buy houses that have this crazy thing attached to them called a garage, which is basically like another house for all of our cars and more of our stuff. And here's the crazy part. A lot of us can't fit all of our stuff in our houses and our garages, so we rent storage units. We live in a culture where overconsumption is just the normal way of life. So much so, we just don't even think about it. But let's pause here before you think I'm condemning everyone with a 2-car garage and a shed in the backyard and ask an important question. Where's the line between healthy participation in economic activity that builds up community and a cycle of greedy accumulation of money and stuff? Well, here's the deal with greed. Greed isn't necessarily something that you can always tell by how much stuff or how much money a person has. Instead, greed is something that you find in the heart. Greed is an internal sin. It's a deep longing for that which you haven't been given. It's less visible in moments of active sin and more evident in long-term corrosion of our souls. It's also a sin of faithlessness. Greed is the opposite of trust in God's provision. It's a grasping for security instead of resting in Jesus. Greed is basically saying, I need something more than what God has given me to feel like a complete person. The person who is greedy believes that they have earned all of the good things that have come their way, and therefore they have determined that they are in control of their possessions and wealth and have the right to use it in whatever way they see fit. This is why Andy Stanley says that greedy people have a supersized sense of ownership. This is all mine, and I get to do with it whatever I want. Now, there's a story in the book of Luke where some brothers come to Jesus and they're arguing about how much each of them should get out of their inheritance. And so Jesus says to them, this is Luke 12:15, he says, "Watch out, be on your guard against all kinds of greed. Life doesn't consist in an abundance of possessions." Now, this seems like an obvious truth to us, doesn't it? Most people, we'd say, yeah, obviously, there is way more to life than just having an abundance of possessions. There's more to living than owning a lot of stuff. But do we actually believe that? Is that something we just say out loud, or is it something that our lives demonstrate as well? Jesus knows that a lot of people agree with that statement but don't necessarily live that way, so he tells a story to help it sink into our hearts. He says, "The ground of a certain rich man, it yielded an abundant harvest. He thought to himself, 'What shall I do? I have no place to store my crops.' And then he said, 'This is what I'll do. I will tear down my barns and I'll build bigger ones. And there I'll store my surplus grain. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of grain stored up for many years. Take life easy, eat, drink, be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, this very night your life will be demanded of you. Then who will get what you've prepared for yourself?'" When we read this passage, we end up seeing one huge fatal flaw in this farmer's thinking. You know, the farmer, he experienced success and he ends up with great wealth, and he says, "What shall I do with my extra?" He doesn't say, "What does God want me to do with my extra?" Instead, he says, "What shall I do with my extra?" This is greed. Greed is assuming that the extra that God gives you is yours and yours alone to use however the heck you see fit. Well, Jesus finishes this story by saying this. This is verse 21. "This is how it will be with whoever stores up things for themselves, but is not rich towards God." Basically, he's saying, hey, if you live your life for your possessions, you're going to die, and you're not going to take any of it with you, and you're going to realize that that's not how God wanted you to live. Each week when we look at a different enemy of the heart, we've been talking about how they all have the potential to ruin our relationships with others and our relationships with God. And greed is tricky to see how it hurts our relationships with others. Because why does it matter if I die and don't get to take any of it with me? At least I got to enjoy it while I was alive, right? Well, here's something to think about. God entrusts us with wealth and possessions, not just so that we can have them, but so that we can use them for His glory and His purposes. It's not just about dying and not taking anything with us. It's about coming to the end of our lives and realizing that we've actually missed out on the joy and the purpose that God had in store for us if we had used our wealth the way He wanted us to. There is joy in using what God has given us for His purposes. And that's why in Acts 20, verse 35, it tells us that Jesus said, "It's more blessed to give than to receive." Basically, greed robs you of the joy that you could have. But greed also, it ties you deeply to your money and your possessions in such a way that causes anxiety and relational stress. How many people do you know who would just have a heart attack, a conniption, if you went outside and scratched their car right now? Or how many people do you know that are obsessed with worrying about the stock market? Or think about people who are currently neglecting their spouse and kids in order to work a job that pays enough to provide for their affluent lifestyle. Greed, it robs us of the joy of using our finances for God. It increases our stress, and it keeps us from being present with the people that we care about. So, what should we do? How do we fight off this enemy of the heart? Well, there's a clue actually in that teaching of Jesus that we just read. When Jesus said, "This is how it will be with those who store up things for themselves but aren't rich towards God," He gives us a clue in how to fight this enemy. Notice how the solution here isn't to give up everything and move to a monastery where you don't own anything. No, the solution is to try to be rich toward God. We tend to overcomplicate this statement, so think of it like this. If you give your money to a wealth manager, they're going to invest it for you and hopefully turn it into something of more value for you. Being rich toward God is similar. It means looking at what God has already given you and trying to find ways to use it so that it grows into something that God sees as good and valuable. It's using our resources in such a way where when it comes time to cash our check, you can show God how you've taken the resources He gave you and used it in a way that's good and pleasing to Him. It's essentially about being generous with our time and our money and our possessions towards God's purposes. The way that we fight greed is with generosity. Now, I hope you're able to have a good discussion about greed, what it is, why it hurts us, and how to go about fighting it. And thanks again for being a part of the study today. We'll see you soon.